Hello, welcome to your online lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1. Today we're going to be talking about skeletal tissues. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the many different characteristics of bone. Before getting into the skeletal system, it's important to really begin with discussing the overall function. Our bones offer support. They're the framework of our body. They contribute to the shape, alignment, and positioning of other body parts, which all in all gives each person a particular look depending on how their bones and other structures are oriented. Ligaments, which we've talked about before, are going to attach bone to bone that really act to hold all of the structures or the bones together. Bones also offer protection by forming this sort of bony box that can house and protect vital organs. For example, our skull will protect our brain. Our rib cage will protect our lungs and our heart and some other structures. And our vertebrae will protect our spine. One bone will come together with another bone to form a joint, as we discussed in class, and a muscle will cross a joint. And so when these muscles contract, they're going to move the bone using our bones with their joints as levers. Bones also store minerals such as calcium and phosphorus and other minerals as well. Minerals can be taken from our bones when we need them. So if we need calcium or if we need phosphorus in our blood, we can take it from the store within our bones. And this allows for homeostasis to occur through feedback mechanisms that we've talked about before. So it helps keep our body in homeostasis by being able to take what we need and store what we don't. Another function of bone is called hematopoiesis. This term refers to the formation of blood cells, and it's a vital process that's carried out through what's called myeloid tissue that's found within our bone marrow. And we'll talk about our bone marrow soon. Now, when I talk about blood cells, I'm talking about all blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells. So the production of red blood cells is called erythropoysis. The eryth component here refers to red, really referring to our red blood cells that are called erythrocytes. So erythropoiesis, poiesis is the formation of red blood cells. Whereas leukopoiesis, leuko refers to white, leukocytes are white blood cells, so leukopoiesis is the formation of white blood cells. Let's now look at some examples of bone types. Our bones take a variety of different shapes in our body, and the shape or the structure of the bone will help contribute to its function, as we know. We're going to start by looking at the long bone of the arm called the humerus. And the humerus is called a long bone because of its length, and it takes on a cylindrical shape. Bone B is looking closer at your hand, and we have these small bones within our hand that are called carpal bones. And carpal bones are considered short bones because of their size, and they take on almost like a box-like appearance. So here's just one example. Bone C is pointing to our vertebrae, so what houses our spinal cord. And it's considered to be an irregular bone because it takes on a very irregular shape, but still an appropriate shape for its function. And it will take on various shapes depending on what area of the spine we're talking about, but that will come later. Bone D is our sternum, and I've put the words up here so you know how to spell them. Bone D is the sternum, which is in layman terms called the breastbone. And this is considered a flat bone. It takes on a broad sheet-like appearance. Looks like a shield. And then finally, bone E, and we're going to be looking here at the kneecap. This is called the patella. Our kneecap is the patella, and the patella is actually a sesamoid bone because it takes on almost like a seed-like shape. There are other seed-like bones in our body, or sesamoid bones in our body, and that's why this one's pointing here to a part of the hand. But the one that I want you to be concerned about right now is the patella, which is our kneecap. We're going to have a look now at the different parts of specifically a long bone. Remember that when one bone comes into contact with another bone to form a joint, we say that the end of that bone, along with the other bone that comes into contact with it, are called articulating surfaces. When we see the word articulating or articular, in this case, we're talking about joints. Now, an articulating joint will have articular cartilage lined on its bone where the articulation or the movement is occurring. And this is to help prevent damage. It almost acts as a bit of a shock absorber and preventing wear and tear of the bone that's found beneath it. And with age, the articular cartilage can start to degenerate and wear away, which can be problematic for the bone beneath it. Long bones also have compact bone and spongy bone, also known as cancellous bone. We'll see that on an upcoming slide. Here we have compact bone and here we have spongy bone. Here along the shaft of the bone is where we have the solid compact bone. So right here is all compact. Think of it as it's compacted so much together that it is very dense. Whereas when we look at spongy bone that's found on the ends here of long bone, it looks kind of like a sponge. And it also gets the name cancellous. You'll see that term on an upcoming slide. So it looks more porous. Next up we have, so we talked about articular cartilage. We're going to look now at the diaphysis and the epiphysis. The diaphysis shown here is the shaft of the bone, the long shaft here. The epiphyses are the end. So we've talked about the prefix epi before and how it usually means on top of, if it helps you remember what that's referring to the ends of your long bone. Next up, I'm going to talk about the endosteum, shown here. The endosteum is the inner lining of bone, if you can sort of appreciate that inner lining here. And it lines this cavity that we'll talk about later, is lined by what's called an endosteum. To help with your studies, we've talked about the term endo before, or end referring to within. Osteum, that root word, refers to bone. Anytime you see osteo or osteum, it's referring to bone. So the endosteum is lining that inner within cavity, but then outside of that, we have what's called the periosteum. And the peri, we know peri means around, osteum means bone. The periosteum is going to line the outer part of the bone. So you can see it looks like it's a layer here. Next up, we have the epiphyseal line. So you can see a bit of a remnant of a line there. Now the term line is just referring to really a remnant. It's this remnant that we can see. We could see it if we looked at an adult, fully grown person's bone, but we could also potentially see it even on an X-ray. And if we see this line, we know that the person is done growing. Otherwise, we would have this plate of cartilage that we'll learn a little bit more about later that would be then called the epiphyseal growth plate. But then once you stop growing, it closes in, turns to bone, and it turns into just what's called an epiphyseal line. The medullary cavity and the red marrow cavity. The medullary cavity shown here is going to house yellow marrow. Yellow bone marrow. We'll talk more about that later. And then through here, you can see these openings, the porous area of the spongy bone, that's going to contain red bone marrow. And so it's called red marrow cavity. So we have yellow marrow found within the medullary cavity throughout the shaft or the diaphysis of long bone. And then the ends are going to have spongy bone. And the spongy bone is going to have these cavities present within it that are going to be filled with our red bone marrow. And it's red marrow, as mentioned on the previous slide, that's going to house, or not the previous slide, but the one before, that's going to house the production site for red blood cells and white blood cells. Now, many of these terms are going to come up again on upcoming slides, so hopefully you have a good starting foundation. So in our previous slide, we talked about some of the components or parts of a long bone, and now we're going to talk about the parts of a flat bone. And flat bones possess many similar features as long bone, but it does lack certain structures, such as the diaphysis, the long shaft part of the bone. It lacks the epiphyses, which are the end parts of the bone, and it also lacks the epiphyseal line, or that growth plate I spoke about earlier. Now, because it doesn't have the long shaft part of the bone that we would recall as this part here housing the yellow marrow, it means that it's not going to have any yellow marrow present within it. Now, the example we're going to look at today of a flat bone is part of the skull. But you might remember from a previous slide, I had said that the sternum, or your breastbone, is also a flat bone. So let's look at some similar characteristics then between long and flat bones. First of all, flat bones, just like long bones, have both compact bone as well as cancellous or spongy bone, as I mentioned previously. It also has a periosteum and an endosteum, so those are those linings, and it does possess red bone marrow. So let's look at it a little closer at the image. So we're going to look closely here. And we're going to start with the feature of compact bone. Compact bone is going to, when we talk about flat bones, is going to have both an external and an external table. All that means is that there's going to be, looking closely here, one layer here, and you can hardly see it, but the solid dense part here, that's compact bone. This is the external table, compact bone, and then we have an inner layer here. Okay, so external and then internal, an internal layer of compact bone, and then in between, sandwich in between, is the cancellous or the spongy bone. So you can think of it like a sandwich. The bread is the compact bone on either side, and then the inside meaty part of the sandwich is going to be the cancellous or the spongy bone. And you can see it also has another name, because why not? And that's diplo. Okay, now outside of the compact bone, remember here's your compact bone here. Outside of the compact bone, we have another layer called the periosteum, and we spoke about that with long bone. And then in between this porous region here, just like what we would see at the ends of long bone, is red bone marrow. And red bone marrow, we know, is what's going to be producing blood cells, both red blood cells and white blood cells. Now this slide is going to be quite a lot of review for you with a little bit of extra detail on the parts specifically of a long bone. So remember that diaphysis is the long shaft part of the bone. It's this cylindrical shape that has thick compact bone here, and then it has that medullary hollowed out region between. And the function of the diaphysis, the shaft of the bone, is going to be able to provide strong support without being too cumbersome in terms of how much it weighs. The epiphyses, we know, are going to be the ends of the long bone. So we're going to have 1, 2. And its structure takes on sort of a bulb-like shape as it expands at the outside part of the bone. We know that this is going to be containing cancellous or spongy bone, that porous area shown here, not shown here just because of how it's dissected. And it's going to be filled with marrow, specifically red bone marrow. The purpose of the epiphyses, aside from the location of spongy bone for the production of blood cells, is going to provide attachment for muscles and also to give stability to joints, because you would have another bone that would come into contact with this bone, allowing for stability. We've talked about articular cartilage found on the articular surfaces of articulating bones. So that covers the top part of the epiphysis. We'd see it here as well. But more specifically, that articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage. And we talked about this when we spoke about synovial joints in our last class. And the purpose of the articular cartilage, as I've alluded to already, is going to be to cushion and support through the constant activities of our daily life and prevent wear and tear on the bone found beneath it. The periosteum, that outer layer of bone that we saw with both the flat bones and the long bones, is a very dense material. And it takes on a white appearance, but it is a fibrous material. So it's very strong, and its function, this outer covering bone, is really to integrate into the tendon that attaches to it. So we spoke about tendons in our last class that attach to bone. We also possess very special cells that we'll talk about in an upcoming topic that allow for both the formation of bone and the destruction of bone. And this is essential for bone health, but we'll come back to that. Still looking at parts of a long bone now, but we're going a little bit more internal. We already spoke about the medullary, which is also known as the marrow cavity. And that's that cavity that's going to be found within the diaphysis of the bone. It's a hollow space that's going to be filled with yellow bone marrow. We'll talk about yellow bone marrow in a moment. We also have the epiphyseal line that I spoke about. Remember, when we see the line, it means it's mature bone where you're done growing, but when there's a plate present of cartilage, it implies that the person is still growing. And so this is sort of a division between the top part of the epiphysis and the diaphysis. The yellow marrow found within the diaphysis, or that medullary cavity of long bones, is a type of connective tissue that is filled with fat, or adipocytes. Adipocytes, these are cells made of fat. Adipo is referring to fat. Now, an infant or a child's body is going to contain primarily red bone marrow throughout all of their bones. And this is because they are at a state where they need constant production of red blood cells as they're growing and developing. But as an individual ages, the red marrow is going to be gradually replaced by yellow marrow. So that's to this statement here that the red bone marrow is going to be infiltrated by the yellow bone marrow or adipose tissue, fat tissue, as an individual ages. So when you're young, virtually all of your bones are going to contain red bone marrow to produce blood cells. But then as you age, it's going to change where less of your bones contain red bone marrow and instead they become filled with yellow marrow. And you do not need to write this down, but just so that you're aware, the main bones in an adult that do still contain red bone marrow include your ribs, include the bodies of your vertebrae, the ends of your humerus, so that long bone of your arm, your pelvis, and your femur. And so if bone marrow needs to be extracted from an individual for whatever reason, depending on the age of the person would determine where red bone marrow could be extracted from. And it's interesting to note that even though yellow bone marrow does replace a lot of the red bone marrow as we get older, if there is a time where somebody is exposed to maybe radiation or certain chemicals that are toxic, or maybe they've had chronic bleeding, some of the yellow bone marrow can actually revert back to red bone marrow in order to produce more blood cells during times of need. Okay, so we've spoken then about red marrow. And I also want you to make note here that we know red bone marrow is responsible for hematopoiesis, or the formation of blood cells, but what I want you to also be aware of is that it's all blood cells. So not just red blood cells, those are certainly a big one, but also white blood cells. And then finally, we have the endosteum, that inner lining that medullary cavity in the diaphysis of long bones. And just like the periosteum contained bone cells, the endosteum does contain various bone cells as well, including the stem cells that produce them to begin with. Bone tissue, also sometimes called osseous tissue, is considered the most distinctive form of connective tissue. We talked a lot about connective tissue in our tissues lecture. Now, bone possesses many of the same features as other connective tissues that we've spoken about, except that the extracellular components, when we talk about bone, so extracellular meaning outside of the bone cells, everything around the cells, are going to be hard and calcified. Bones are rigid structures, and because of that, it can be supportive and also protective. The tensile strength of bone is nearly equal to that of cast iron, so very strong, but it's less than 1/3 of the weight of cast iron. Bone is organized in such a way that its great strength and its minimal weight result from a very perfected interrelationship of its structural components. Now, we can't see it as well yet in this image, but just to give you an introduction, if we looked really close here, and I'm going to see if I can zoom in, what makes this porous appearance are these different branches of bone that you can see. And these branches of bone, we'll learn, are called trabeculae. And because of that name, trabeculae, sometimes cancellous or spongy bone is also known as trabecular bone. But I just wanted to introduce that to you. Now, when you look at this, you might think at first glance that the position of the trabeculae, or those branches that gives this spongy appearance, that they're very unorganized and very random. But there really is an underlying complex organization to them. All of these bony branches that you can see, the trabeculae, they're organized or arranged along lines of stress, and their size and their orientation are going to differ between individual bones according to the nature of the load that's going to be applied, or the magnitude of the load that's going to be applied. And so what this image here is showing us with these red arrows, and this is just a longitudinal section of bone, is that the trabeculae are oriented along lines of stress. And that will prevent fractures that would otherwise occur and allow for efficiency. We're going to look now at what makes up the extracellular matrix of bone, and you can look back to your tissues lecture to review extracellular matrix. But the extracellular matrix of bone is what contributes to its hardness, to its rigidity. The extracellular matrix more specifically is called lamella or lamellae, which is a calcified, or we can say mineralized matrix that's organized in these concentric circles, as we'll see in compact bone. And it's organized as the trabeculae, which I spoke about earlier, in cancellous or spongy bone. Inorganic salts are going to account for about 65% of bone tissue, so quite a lot. And it's these salts, these inorganic salts, that contribute to the bone hardness and really to the weight and the strength of bone. You can see here a list of different salts that are found embedded within the extracellular matrix. So we have hydroxyapatite, which is calcium and phosphate crystals, magnesium, sodium, sulfate, and fluoride. And they're oriented in such a way that they can most effectively resist any stress or mechanical deformation. So when when forces are applied to the bone, we want to be able to resist those forces causing the bone to deform in a harmful way. And so these salts here are going to be found embedded in the extracellular matrix, but we're also going to have them existing in excess, so that if, as part of a negative feedback mechanism, if we need any extra of a particular inorganic salt, well, it's stored within our bone and we can borrow it from there. We also have an organic matrix. This matrix consists of a gel-like ground substance that's made up of collagenous fibers and proteins and polysaccharides, things that we've talked about in previous lecture. And this also contributes to the strength of bone and contributes to some resilience, but is also involved in metabolic functions. So a little bit of information on compact versus cancellous bone, which we will elaborate on upcoming slides. Compact bone makes up the majority of the mass of bone, cancellous bone making up a smaller amount. Specifically, if we look at compact bone, so remember, compact bone would be found in the shaft, as part of the shaft of the long bone or the diaphysis, but we also know that it sandwiches the cancellous or spongy bone of flat bones. But compact bones, we have alluded to the fact already that they're very dense and solid in comparison to cancellous bone, which has these open spaces that are created by these branching trabeculae. The structure of compact bone is dependent on what's called an osteon or a Haversian system. And so this structure here is called an osteon, and we'll look at this closely next. The lamellae, which we know is the extracellular matrix of bone, of compact bone, in this case, is arranged in concentric circles. So the extracellular matrix then, this is compact bone, showing you a piece from here, this flat bone here. This here is the osteon, but we'll come back to that as I said. And then the extracellular matrix, so the area kind of in and around the cells, is arranged in concentric circles in compact bone, and I mentioned that already on a previous slide. The function of compact bone is protection and physical support. It's a nice, solid, dense structure for support. Cancellous bone, on the other hand, or our spongy bone, we talked about its appearance already. The extracellular matrix of cancellous bone is the trabeculae, those branching structures. And the purpose of the cancellous or spongy bone, so this region here, or the ends of long bones, we know is that it's going to be filled with myeloid tissue that supports red bone marrow. And we know red bone marrow produces blood cells. I'm also going to introduce something that is going to come up again, and that is the word osteocytes. So cytes means cells, osteo means bone, so these are bone cells. Bone cells, or osteocytes, are going to be sitting in these structures here. They sit in something called a lacunae. So here's a lacunae, here's a lacunae, and again, remember we have those concentric circles, that's the extracellular matrix outside of the cells. And the osteocytes are going to sit in these lacunae, and the lacunae are sort of like little lakes that contain the osteocyte. And these lacunae are connected to one another by what are called canaliculi, almost like little canals. Or if this is a lake, these are like little rivers or connections to that lake from other lakes. But we'll look at that on upcoming slides. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about compact bone. You should be able to recognize that this is compact bone based on some of the structures and the appearance that we've spoken about already. But we're going to look on this slide specifically on the osteon, or the Haversian system. And I'd mentioned on this slide that the structure of compact bone is its osteon. So osteons, which we saw, this is an osteon, this is an osteon. Here in this drawn image, you can see this is an osteon, this is an osteon, this is half of an osteon, and so is this, and so is this. Half of an osteon because of how this bone has been cut to demonstrate its components. The osteon is the functional unit of compact bone, and that's very important for you to know, that the functional unit of compact bone is the osteon. And it's the osteon, this structure here, found all throughout compact bone, that is going to permit the delivery of nutrients and the removal of waste products to and from bone. And I had mentioned already that these areas right here, found all throughout, these are like little lakes, openings where osteocytes reside, and they're imprisoned there. They can't leave there, but they're very metabolically active. And if they're metabolically active, they need some method of receiving nutrients and getting rid of waste. And so what we can see, so here's an example of a lacunae, and then the osteocyte within it. And then what we can see is all these radiating structures here. These radiating structures, which you can see finely throughout here, these are like little canals off of the lacunae or off of the lake. And they are going to be what permit the receiving of nutrients and the removal of waste. And we call these tiny canals canaliculi, as I've already mentioned. So a couple of other features of osteons that we will look at in a little bit more detail coming up is that the osteons, so this structure here, they surround central canals. So here's a central canal, here's a central canal. You can see a central canal but cut off here as well. So it's just a canal running longitudinally along the bone. And within that canal, you can see that we have red and blue vessels representing arteries and veins, and these yellow structures that are nerves that travel throughout them. We can also see that there's these transverse canals that also house blood vessels and nerves, allowing for connection between different areas of bone to allow for blood supply and removal of waste. We already spoke about how osteons contain lacunae, those little lakes that contain osteocytes within them. These are mature living bone cells. Again, they're trapped here, but metabolically active. And so really, all of these osteons, it would make sense to you, they really create the structural framework of compact bone, but they are the functional unit. Now remember earlier I had mentioned that the extracellular matrix of bone is called lamellae, not to be confused with lacunae. Lamellae is the bone matrix. And I've spoken about it already as these concentric, almost concentric circles, or this concentric pattern that makes up our osteon structure or contributes to it. So the bony structure that you can see through here is the concentric lamellae, and it gets that name because it's arranged in these concentric circles. Now, we also have two other types or variations of lamellae that exist: interstitial and circumferential. Interstitial usually refers to in between. So this lamellae, or this bone matrix, is going to be found in between your osteons. So they're not contributing to the actual concentric circles that make up the osteon, but they're found in between. So any of that bony matrix you can see in between is interstitial lamellae. Circumferential lamellae are layers of bone matrix that surround the all the osteons. So they run along the circumference of bone on both the outer circumference and the inner circumference. So thinking back to the boundary of the medullary cavity, or that hollow part of the diaphysis, or the long shaft of the bone, it's going to have circumferential lamellae present. We're going to now talk about what are referred to as the waterways or the passageways of fluid throughout our bone. We've already talked about lacunae and how they're like these little lakes. And these little lakes we know are going to contain osteocytes that are sort of imprisoned within that lake. But there's also fluid that's present there. So if we know that this is the concentric lamellae making up the osteon, you can see in between we have the lacunae, those little lakes that house the osteocytes. And also within there is fluid. So think of it as these osteocytes are just entrapped in this lake that contains fluid. We've also talked about canaliculi, these very small canals that radiate in all directions from the lacunae. So you can see them radiating out here. And it allows for connections between the different lacunae, but also connections to the central canal, where we have blood vessels, including ones that bring nutrient-rich blood to the bone, and which is the red, and the blue, which is taking away waste product. So these blood vessels then are running through what was already mentioned before, what's called the central canal that runs along longitudinally through the bone. And so it's labeled here as the central canal, also known as the Haversian canal, containing various vessels. And what's not shown here is there's also going to be lymphatic vessels, and that's something that will come up a lot in your second semester. And lymphatic vessels are involved in a lot of our immune system and keeping tissues healthy. And then the transverse canal I've already mentioned. This is where you're going to have a connection. It's running transversely between this central canal and this central canal. So it is these structures then that allow for the movement of nutrients and waste throughout bone. So we've spoken quite a bit about compact bone and its features. We're taking a step back now to look at cancellous bone, which I've described to you earlier as also being called trabecular bone or spongy bone. The trabeculae, remember those are those bony branches. It's the lattice formation of these bony branches that are arranged in a very specific way along lines of stress to allow for our bones to handle daily loads. There is no osteons in cancellous bone. Remember, this is the functional unit of compact bone spoken about earlier. There are canaliculi present, and they work very similar as what we spoke about in compact bone, where they're going to allow for the movement of nutrients and the removal of waste. Bone cells are also going to receive blood supply. They have to, as we know, every cell in our body needs a blood supply, and this is going to come from the bone marrow within that medullary cavity of cancellous bone that we spoke about before. And so if I zoom in to this, what we've looked at before, remember the bone marrow is going to be found, the red bone marrow in between the trabeculae here. And so spongy bone is able to get its own blood supply from there as well. Let's talk now about the different types of bone cells that exist. We have osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Osteo refers to bone. And we're going to start looking at the osteoblasts. These are active bone-forming cells. So think of the B in blasts as being building, bone building. These cells actively build bone, and this is happening all the time. We're constantly building bone, and as you'll learn soon, we're also constantly breaking down bone. And so what happens with these osteoblasts is they're these small cells, and they're going to make or synthesize and then secrete a substance called osteoid. Osteoid is the unmineralized organic component of bone. And what will happen is collagen strands that are found within the osteoid are going to serve as really the framework for the formation of those hydroxyapatite crystals that I spoke about earlier that contribute to the mineralization of bone tissue. Osteocytes, on the other hand, we spoke about these guys as being embedded in the calcified matrix of bone, but they're lying within that small lake or the lacunae. So if we go back to this slide here, the lacunae, remember, are going to be found here in between the lamellae, those concentric circles, and they're going to house an osteocyte. And osteocytes, when I mentioned earlier that they are found within the lacunae and they're sort of imprisoned there. They can't get out, but they are metabolically active. So they're considered mature, but they're non-dividing. So they're not going through cell division. They're just doing their job. So they're considered to be non-dividing or inactive osteoblasts. So osteoblasts actually form bone, but once they mature, they become called osteocytes. They remain within the lacunae and they are non-dividing. Osteoclasts, these are bone breaking or bone destroying cells. Clast means to break. So these are going to be these giant, compared to the small osteoclasts, these giant bone destroying cells that are going to break down the bone, actively erode it. They also contain a large number of mitochondria and lysosomes. If we look here up at this image, here's an osteoclast, and you can see how much larger it is, and you can see some of the multiple nuclei compared to smaller osteoblasts. These are bone building and bone breaking. It's an important consideration here on the rate of bone breaking versus the rate of bone forming. We want it to be in balance. We want to break down bone, but at an equal rate build bone. Otherwise, we lose bone if we're breaking down more than we're actually producing. And this is something that is a consideration for women that are postmenopausal. They have an imbalance. The osteoblast activity is reduced and the osteoclast activity is increased, which means they're breaking down more bone than they're building, which makes their bones weaker and can cause them to develop what you've, I'm sure, heard of is osteoporosis. Final thing I wanted to show you on this slide is this is an osteocyte that's housed in its little lake, its lacunae, and you can see that the osteocyte has these what are called cytoplasmic processes that are going to travel through the canaliculi in order to communicate with each other, as I've already mentioned. Now this slide talks about bone marrow, and much of what I'm going to be speaking of I've already spoken to, so this is a bit of review. Bone marrow is a soft connective tissue called myeloid tissue, and it serves for the production of blood cells, in particular that red bone marrow. So where do we find marrow? Well, remember that in the medullary cavities of long bones, so that cavity found within the diaphysis or the shaft of long bones, we have yellow bone marrow. And then within the spaces of spongy or cancellous or trabecular bone, we have red bone marrow, where we know that blood cells are going to be produced. And this would include red blood cells and white blood cells. And this is showing you what that would look like. The red marrow, more red in color, and you can actually see the yellow marrow a little bit faintly here. Okay, so red bone marrow is, when you're a child or an infant, is going to be found in pretty much all of your bones. But then as you grow, the Red bone marrow is going to be replaced by yellow bone marrow, and then only some bones, and I've mentioned these earlier, are going to still persist with red marrow, and that includes your ribs, vertebral bodies, humerus, your pelvis, and your femur, which is your thigh bone, your big thigh bone. Yellow marrow has this unique function. It's really made of adipocytes or fat cells in times of need to convert back to red bone marrow. And it might be a situation where somebody has reduced red blood cells because of a chronic bleed, so anemia, or maybe they've been exposed to radiation or other chemicals where we need more blood cells to be produced, and so that yellow marrow can convert back to red marrow. I had commented earlier that bones act as a reservoir for various minerals in our body, including calcium. In fact, 98% of our body's calcium reserves are stored within our skeletal system. And this has a purpose, which is helping to maintain homeostasis of what we call blood calcium levels. That's the amount of calcium found in the blood. Now, I will elaborate on this part in a moment, but I wanted to skip down to the bottom to let you know that calcium plays a role in a variety of different processes in our body. It's involved in the formation of bone, and not just while you're growing, but also because we're constantly breaking down bone and forming new bone. We are going to be needing calcium for the remodeling of bone, for the repair of bone. Calcium is used in blood clotting, and we'll learn about that next term. It's involved in the transmission of nerve impulses, which we will learn about in upcoming lectures. And calcium is also involved in the maintenance of both skeletal muscle contraction and cardiac muscle contraction, which will also come up in one of your next lectures. Now, popping back up to the maintenance of blood calcium levels. Calcium is going to be mobilized and moved into and out of the blood during bone remodeling. And so when we form bone, remember osteoblasts, B for building, are going to be building bone. And in order to build bone, they're going to take calcium from the blood and use it to build bone. And if it's taking calcium from the blood, it should make sense that it's going to decrease blood circulating levels of calcium. Now, looking at the opposite to that, when we break down bone, and remember bone formation and breakdown of bone are occurring all the time, breaking down bone is occurring by osteoclasts, or bone breaking cells. And what osteoclasts are going to do when they break down bone is it's going to cause the release of calcium from the bone that it's breaking down into the blood, which will then subsequently increase the amount of circulating levels of calcium within your blood. There are two main hormones that are involved in calcium homeostasis, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid gland, and calcitonin is released from the thyroid gland. Here we have the thyroid gland, which is located in really the front of the neck area. And we have these two structures on either side that are called the parathyroid glands. So these little structures then produce parathyroid hormone, and then the thyroid gland here produces calcitonin. And they have opposite effects in what they do. The primary regulator of calcium levels in the blood is going to be the parathyroid gland by its production and secretion of parathyroid hormone. So what stimulates its release? Why is parathyroid hormone released? Well, when blood calcium levels are low, the parathyroid gland is going to secrete parathyroid hormone. So how does it know that the calcium levels in the blood are low? Well, just because blood that's passing through it. As blood passes through the parathyroid gland, it will pick up that the blood calcium levels are lower than they should be, and so it will release parathyroid hormone in order to increase blood calcium levels back to normal, again bringing us back to homeostasis. So this is occurring all the time. Now, how does parathyroid hormone increase blood calcium levels? Well, there's three primary principles. One is it's going to stimulate osteoclasts, which we know are our bone breaking cells, to start breaking down that bony matrix in order to release some of the calcium that we know is stored within it as really a reserve. And that's going to be put into the blood to bring calcium levels back up to normal. In addition, though, it's going to increase renal absorption of calcium. And what this means, when we say renal, we're talking about the kidneys. It's going to increase the kidneys' absorption of calcium, which puts more calcium into the blood instead of getting rid of it. In addition, parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate vitamin D synthesis. And what this will do is it will increase the efficiency of your intestines actually absorbing calcium from your diet. Now, conversely, looking at calcitonin is going to be released when blood calcium levels are too high, so very much the opposite of what we just spoke about. And so its purpose is going to bring blood calcium levels back down to normal, back to homeostasis. And how it does this is it stimulates bone deposition by osteoblasts, so it encourages bone building, and we need calcium in order to build bone. It's also going to inhibit osteoclast activity, so that should make sense. If it tells the osteoclast to stop breaking down bone, which would ultimately put calcium into your blood, then less will be put into the blood. And we can see this with this image here, what I just spoke about, that when blood travels through these glands, they're going to detect levels of calcium in the blood. If they're low, we know parathyroid hormone is going to be released. If it's high, we know that calcitonin is going to be released. Parathyroid hormone is going to do a number of different things, but the main one spoken here is to break down the bony matrix to release calcium stores, bringing our calcium levels back to normal. Whereas calcitonin is going to decrease the amount of bony matrix that's being broken down, so inhibiting that osteoclast activity, among other things, in order to bring our blood calcium levels back down and ultimately back to normal. I'm going to speak now to the development of bone. When the skeleton begins to form before you are born, it's going to consist of not bones, but cartilage and fiber structures that are shaped very similar to what you think of when you think of bones. Now, over time, what we call these cartilage models, they're going to become transformed into real bones when that cartilage gets replaced by a calcified bone matrix. So we have this process of constant remodeling that's occurring as bone is growing. And in order for this to happen successfully, we need the constant continuous activity by our bone-forming osteoblasts and our bone-resorbing or bone-breaking osteoclasts. While you're growing, osteoblast activity should be greater than osteoclast activity because we need to actually build more bone than we're breaking down in order to grow. Then over time, osteoblast and osteoclast activity will be fairly similar or occur at a similar rate. And then with age, osteoclast activity can occur at a greater rate than osteoblast activity, which means bone is getting broken down, may be broken down at a faster rate than it's being built, which can predispose a person to having weaker bones and developing osteoporosis. So the term osteogenesis, genesis is the formation of, osteo is bone. This is where we're developing bone from a cartilage or a membrane model into adult bone. When this cartilage hardens and turns to bone, it's called ossification. You can see in this image here, which is showing you what it would look like at birth in terms of bone versus cartilage content in the body, or as part of the skeleton, we can see there's a lot of cartilage represented by the purple-blue color. A lot of cartilage all throughout. You can see that quite significantly throughout the rib cage as well. And then over time, ossification will occur. There are two models that we're going to look at in more detail by which we develop bone. One is called intramembranous ossification, and the other is called endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification is going to be occurring in flat bones, for example, the skull, and we'll look at that specifically. But most other bones are formed from their cartilage model through a process called endochondral ossification. We're going to start by looking at intramembranous ossification. Remember that that's going to be occurring with flat bones such as the skull. And what will happen is these osteogenic stem cells, so stem cells are cells that can differentiate or change into a more specialized cell. So you can think of these as more generalized bone cells that can become many different kinds of bone cells. So osteogenic stem cells are going to differentiate or change into our bone building cells called osteoblasts. These osteoblasts are going to cluster together in an area, which we call an ossification center. Remember, ossification is turning to bone. They're going to lay down matrix material and collagen fibers in the area, and this will accumulate. So we have large amounts of ground substance, which is a component of the matrix that's going to accumulate in the area by each osteoblast. There's going to be that deposition of collagen fibers, really starting to form the bony matrix. And then when calcium is added, this is going to harden the matrix, really ossify it. Then we're going to start to see some organization of the bone appearing. So as these osteoblasts are building bone, you're going to get osteoclasts that sort of carve their way through it, which ends up forming that trabeculae or that spongy cancellous appearance that we've seen in previous pictures. And remember, when we talk about flat bones, I spoke earlier that we have it's almost like a sandwich where in the center of the sandwich, the meaty part is the spongy bone, and then the bread on the outside is the hard compact bone. So we're going to get the hard plates of compact bone on either side, really the bread of the sandwich, that are also going to be formed. And then we're going to see a process called appositional growth occurring. So once we've created the bone, now we're going to be adding osseous tissue or bony tissue to the outside of it to allow for it to continue to grow. And appositional growth, we'll see that term again, is really growth in width. So we're going to see that the bone is able to get thicker, and it's going to continue to get harder over time and wider throughout its development. So you don't need to worry about too much detail on this slide, but just to speak to a few ideas that I've spoken about. I had mentioned we're going to have an ossification center that first develops where we have a clustering of these osteoblasts or bone building cells. We're going to see over time that we're starting to form a bony matrix here. Mature cells, mature osteoblasts are osteocytes, and remember, these are not actually actively dividing, they just sort of maintain the bone. Over time, we can see trabeculae forming where those osteoclasts have sort of carved their way through to allow for that spongy bone appearance. And then we have the plate of compact bone here and here that is sandwiching the spongy bone on the inside. And again, that's flat bones. But most bones are actually formed by endochondral ossification, where there's this cartilage model that develops into bone. I'm going to be going back and forth between this slide and the next just to tie what I'm talking about into the image. So let's go to the next slide now, starting here. Here's our cartilage model. Okay, so we start with a cartilage model. And what will ultimately happen is we'll start sort of in the central part of the cartilage model, and the bony formation will spread towards the ends. And that's why it's called endochondral ossification. Ossification is the formation of bone, chondral is cartilage, endo is within. So within the cartilage, we're going to start ossification, and as I said, it will spread towards the ends of bones or the epiphyses. Okay, so that's this statement here. What we're going to see happening is a periosteum, or that outer covering of bone, is going to develop. Remember, this is the layer that will be tied in with tendons. The periosteum will develop and it will enlarge, and it forms what's called a collar of bone, or a bony collar. So let's see what that looks like here. You can see this bony collar making up the periosteum here. Next up, we have a primary ossification center that forms. So this is the first center where ossification is occurring. And what we'll see is that this occurs when a blood vessel enters the cartilage model right at the midpoint of the diaphysis. So let's see what that looks like. Here's that blood vessel that enters. And what this is going to do, so that's right at the diaphysis, is it forms the primary bone forming center, or the primary ossification center. And that's because now that we have blood supply to the area, we can really bring substances to the area that will help build bone. The bone will grow in length. We'll see that this is called interstitial growth. We'll see that on an upcoming slide. So the bone will grow in length as endochondral ossification progresses from the diaphysis towards each epiphysis. So it's moving in this direction, and that contributes to the growth in length. Then we're going to have secondary ossification centers, which are going to occur in the epiphyses. So we're going to see here, we're starting to see activity in the epiphyses, and of course this would be both epiphyses where it's occurring, and here's our secondary ossification center. And now this is where we're going to be forming cancellous bone or spongy bone as a focus. But something that does remain is that epiphyseal plate. Remember, that's the growth plate. So that would be approximately here, here, and you can see it's being maintained. And this epiphyseal plate, this will not be turning to bone because we need to continue to grow from birth until we reach the age where we stop growing. And so that needs to remain there, and we'll see on the next slide that this area is very active with a lot of division occurring and formation of bone in order to allow for growth. And then here you can see that after that epiphyseal plate is not needed anymore and the cells stop dividing because we're done growing, then it's just a remnant, an epiphyseal line. So a little bit more on endochondral ossification, but specifically looking at the epiphyseal plate. Remember that most bones are going to be forming by endochondral ossification. And if we look specifically at this epiphyseal plate here and we enlarge it so that, or magnify it so that we're looking at it microscopically, we can see that there's these different layers, and the different layers have different functions. But remember, the purpose here is to ultimately produce bone so that our bones can grow in length. The first layer of cells are called resting cartilage cells, and they're not shown in this image, but they would be the layer that is going to attach the epiphyses to the shaft or to the diaphysis. We need these two parts of the bone to be firmly attached together, or as firm as they can be, otherwise it would break. So the resting cartilage cells really attach the epiphysis to the diaphysis. And so these aren't cells that are changing or proliferating. They're just sort of resting there and allowing for a good attachment. But now we're going to look at the proliferating zone, the next layer here. And the proliferating zone consists of stacks of chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage and cytes means cells. So lots of cells here that are cartilage cells. And these are going to be actively undergoing mitosis, permitting thickening of that layer, allowing for the plate itself to lengthen. Then we have the zone of hypertrophy, and this is just a zone of older and large cells that are starting to undergo degenerative changes that are associated with calcium deposition, because remember, we want to be forming bone in order to grow. And then we have the calcified cartilage and ossification zone, where we're starting to now form bone, and this is where dead or dying cartilage cells are now undergoing rapid calcification, so turning into bone. So this is the process by which our growth plate will have cell layers that will turn to bone to contribute to our growth. So think of it as almost like it's a layer of bricks that are being laid constantly in order to contribute to the length of bone growth. And growth in length, as I already mentioned to you, which you'll see on the next slide, is called interstitial growth. And you can see in this image some of that growth being shown here, with the length increase as chondrocytes are dividing, and we have calcification of cartilage to form bone. On this slide, it shows the term interstitial growth that I mentioned before. That's that growth in length. And I'd mentioned on a previous slide as well that we have appositional growth, and that's that growth in diameter or growth in width of the bone. So bones grow in this direction, that's appositional, and in this direction, and of course downward as well, and that lengthens the bone, and that's called interstitial growth. We can see here is a growing bone versus an adult bone where that epiphyseal line or the growth plate has closed, and that person can no longer grow under normal circumstances. During the early stages of ossification or bone formation, bone tissue is going to develop in really this chaotic pattern where you have these mineralized layers. And it gives this appearance where it almost looks like woven bone. Now, soon, throughout development, this woven bone is going to be replaced by a much stronger layered bone that we know is called lamellar bone. Remember, we spoke about lamellae with the extracellular matrix. And this is going to be characterized by the presence of many osteons, which we know are the functional unit of bone. The first osteons that are formed within this lamellar layer are called primary osteons. So these develop early within that woven bone. So what we can see happening in terms of forming what we know of as an osteon is that in this image here, the first part, and this is progressive, the osteoclast, the bone breaking or bone resorbing cells, are going to hollow out a space here, this fibrous space, which sort of sets the canvas for the development of bone. Osteoblasts that are found within the endosteum, that inner layer of that medullary cavity that we spoke about earlier, is going to start depositing the bony matrix, forming those layers, the lamellae that we know of. We can see the concentric circle starting to form, remembering that this bony part is lamellae. And then when the osteoblasts mature, and they are no longer needed for the actual laying down of matrix, they get trapped, and you can see them trapped all through here in what we spoke about earlier as the lacunae. So the lacunae are found within or in between the lamellae, or those different concentric circles, and then they will maintain bone in their presence. What ends up happening is we end up leaving behind this central canal that we spoke about earlier, where we have blood vessels, nerves, there's also lymphatic vessels, and then this, what we called a primary osteon, is going to eventually continue to develop and become a secondary osteon. And of course, we know that it is the combined action of our osteoclasts and our osteoblasts where we're going to be able to have growth in length and diameter of bone. Remember that bone remodeling is necessary with this combined action of our osteoclasts and osteoblasts for growth, but it's also important just for homeostasis once we stop growing in order to maintain our blood calcium levels at the very narrow range that they're meant to be for normal function. We can see here that osteoclasts are going to be working hard at enlarging the medullary cavity, whereas osteoblasts are going to be really forming the outer part of bone, that periosteum. And so once you get to a certain age where osteoclast activity exceeds osteoblasts, the osteoclast activity is greatest in the inner part of bone, eating away at it at a faster rate than we're depositing bone, leading potentially to the development of osteoporosis. And aside from just general lifestyle choices, mechanical stress, physical activity has such a great way of strengthening bone. So when we exercise, we're actually promoting the deposition and strength of our bone. And so keeping active at a young age, but certainly once we have this role reversal here where we're breaking down bone faster than we are building it, it's important to maintain physical activity and apply mechanical stress to our bones to encourage more bony deposition. And so the final comment to make here is that weight-bearing activities such as walking and jogging and other forms of exercise, what they'll do is subject the bone to mechanical stress. And this will mean that the bone will respond by laying down more collagen fibers and mineral salts that we know contribute to the formation of a bony matrix, making our bones stronger. But inactivity and lack of exercise will tend to weaken bones because of the opposite occurring, decreased collagen formation, and not enough calcium being deposited. So very important with age to encourage weight-bearing exercise to prevent the development of osteoporosis and potentially fractures. So a fracture, and I'm not talking about this with respect to osteoporosis, but I'm talking about it from when we're growing. Now, a fracture is any break in the continuity of bones. So any break to any degree is referred to as a fracture, and there are different types of fractures, which you'll learn about in later courses. But the epiphyseal plate is a common site for bone fractures to occur in young people. So if a young person that hasn't stopped growing has an injury, they could end up with a fracture at that epiphyseal plate. And the reason for that is because it hasn't hardened yet. It's not bone, so it is more predisposed to a fracture depending on the extent of an injury. So what happens when we have a fracture, regardless of the fracture? I'm not referring to an epiphyseal plate fracture. I'm referring to just a fracture in general and some of the events that occur. Now, this is going to vary depending on the situation, but this is just a brief overview for this course. When a fracture occurs, when a break in the continuity of bone occurs, as we can see has happened here, this is going to tear and destroy blood vessels in that area that carry nutrients to the bone cells that normally are there to maintain bone. And what this damage to the vessels will do is initiate a repair sequence. One of the first events that is going to occur that we can see in this image is the development of a hematoma, a fracture hematoma, which is a collection of blood, almost like a large blood clot in the area. The blood clot will be reabsorbed and replaced by a callus, and we can see the callus here, and this is actually fibrocartilage. And this is a special repair tissue that will help bind the ends of the broken bone together, hardening it, making it stronger like it was before it broke.
Hopefully what we see is that the continuity of bone is returned and these two ends of bone that were broken have been lined up fairly well, and then we're left with this remnant here showing you where the bone was repaired and where the fracture was, and this can also show up on x-ray to indicate that a person may have had a previous fracture. Okay, that's finally the end of today's lecture. Thanks a lot for your time. Bye for now.